Good afternoon, class and professor. Today I will be speaking to you all about my project on police brutality in America. Police brutality in America goes back to the early 1900s, and even still today, it is a very popular topic to speak about, with many incidents of police brutality coming to light. I'm going to speak a little bit about the history of police brutality, and it can go as far back as early as the 1800s, but my focus of this project will be from the 1990s to present day America, where we are still seeing many police officers abuse their authority and mistreat individuals, and the mistreatment is being commonly seen with the African American race. When people think of police brutality, individuals will always associate it with officers who have a racial bias and treat individuals based off of their bias, and that has been seen common through many police departments across the nation. One of the more notable incidents of police brutality was the incident involving Rodney King and the four LAPD officers, where they were caught beating up Rodney King badly during a traffic stop with batons and kicking him while other cops just stood around and did nothing to stop the incident. Following the Rodney King incident in 1991 is when the Independent Commission of the Los Angeles Police Department found that there was excessive force being used by many LAPD officers, as stated in Banks 2020. The commission was also known as the Christopher Commission, and they went on to investigate the LAPD more in depth after reviewing radio transmissions that revealed disturbing and recurrent racial remarks, often made in the context of discussing pursuits and beating suspects. The commission additionally discovered that the use of force was linked to racism and bias by many of the LAPD officers. That is worrisome, discovering that these types of issues within a police, as there was these types of issues within a police department, as there's so much uncertainty of how long that the police brutality has been going on and how long the racial bias has been going on within the police department and to what extent it has been taken by the officers. This also becomes an issue internally, where there is a major possibility that complaints were not being taken seriously by internal affairs and more than likely brushed off to avoid repercussions on the officers. Many people describe the actions of the Los Angeles Police Department as an aggressive paramilitary policing with a culture that was mean and cruel, racist and abusive of force in communities of color, particularly poor communities of color. So that was by Krabechik and Bates, 2017. Many of the actions of these officers were geared towards high discretion searches, and that is where many of these issues arise. And similarly to the war on drugs, officers were focused on targeting the lower income neighborhoods, as that is what they believed most of the criminal activity was occurring. Image 1 in this slide is showing a group of individuals protesting against police brutality and fighting as a coalition for change to happen. And image 2 is related to the Rodney King incident, and it is a glimpse of the video taken on the night that Rodney King was brutally beat up by the four LAPD officers. In slide 2, I'm going to talk about how it has affected African Americans, and it is important to learn more as they're constantly dealing with being racially targeted by police departments across the nation and have many negative interactions with law enforcement. One of the more important statistics to look at is that police killings of unarmed Black Americans were associated with worse mental health amongst Black Americans in the general U.S. population. This contributes to the negative impact that police shootings have on mental health of Black Americans, and I believe it is a major reason of why there's so much distrust between the communities and the police departments. Another reason for the distrust between African Americans is that they see firsthand that they are being treated far worse than white Americans, which angers them because in this country we have moved so far in terms of equality for everyone that it is almost as if it doesn't exist when it comes to policing. African American communities feel that it is them against the police because they are constantly fighting to be treated fairly, and when they do what they are supposed to, they get abused by the police officers, which affects them both physically and mentally. Many African Americans believe that these killings are the manifestation of structural racism and implicit signals of the lower value placed on the Black lives by law enforcement, legal institutions, and by society at large. African Americans connect these acts of violence against them to racism because in many of these incidents, lethal force is always being used against African Americans, whereas when an officer interacts with a white person, the officer is less likely to use lethal force against them. Some argue that the reasoning behind this point is that tragically African American boys are viewed as older than their actual age and are believed to be less innocent than their same age white peers. Does this give an officer the right to mistreat African American youth differently because he looks older than his actual age? Absolutely not. Every individual should be treated equally with the same respect no matter what they look like. Many of these officers that act wrongly and abuse their power against African Americans hardly get punished, and complaints are not taken seriously, which leads into the point that these fatalities of African American individuals, with very few officers being indicted, is a major reason why it minimizes blacks' individual and collective confidence in law enforcement. In the image I used for this slide, you can see the group of individuals standing up against the police and showing the officers they are unarmed to show the officers what it is like when they fatally shoot an African American that was unarmed. In slide 3, it's the how has it affected African Americans is continued, and with the effects that police brutality has on the African American community. And the images that I focus to use on for this slide are images showing communities that are angry with the treatment they are receiving, along with the effects that police brutality is having on the youth. Image 4 is depicting a protest in a Dallas community of the brutal murder of George Floyd, which I will speak more about in the next slide in terms of current events. There is a clear example of a community that wants change and will come together to take steps in the right direction. There was a study done of 4,389 urban residents, and in that study, they discovered that the relationship between encounters with the police and depressed mood was stronger among Black respondents. This is a good correlation of their current relationship, as the depressed mood connects to them being mistreated by police officers, along with not having positive interactions with officers, with many of them being negative. Police brutality can be harmful for mental health because it is state sanctioned, with very little accountability for any harm being caused by the police. People question why the relationship continues to be negative between the police and the African American community, but it will always remain the same until change occurs where law enforcement can slowly gain their trust back. Negative police encounters are believed to be stressors, leading to more people to worry about becoming victims to police brutality, and for Black youth, it is their biggest worry. The youth are the next generation, and growing up into the culture where police violence exists and are constantly targeting the African American communities is why when the kids grow up, they begin to develop that same negative feeling to the police, which leads them to have negative encounters based off of incidents in the past. I used image 5 as an example for the youth growing up and seeing the police violence, only for the youth to hide behind their parents, afraid of the people in the uniforms, afraid of what negative things might happen to them at the hands of a police officer. In slide 4, I will be talking about some of the more recent incidents of police brutality that had a major impact on the African American community and law enforcement as a whole. The most significant act of police brutality that we have seen recently is the killing of George Floyd, when Officer Derek Chauvin put his knee on George Floyd's neck for almost 10 minutes, and when Floyd was pleading for medical attention when he couldn't breathe, the officer ignored his call for help and instead watched as Floyd was getting murdered by the officer. The other officers stood around and did not intervene when Floyd called for help, which angered the African American community as they saw one of their own being viciously killed by an officer that is supposed to serve and protect the community. This event sparked protests and riots across the nation for justice for African Americans that fell victim to police brutality, but in this time it focused on getting justice for George Floyd and his family in these dark times. In February of 2012, 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was shot and killed after an altercation in Sanford, Florida with the volunteer neighborhood watchman. George Zimmerman was the shooter in this case and felt that Martin did not belong in the community, and because of this, he believed it gave him reason to shoot Martin, based off of him being suspicious and not being familiar with the neighborhood. This sparked outrage as Zimmerman was acquitted of all charges, and the African American community cannot believe that Zimmerman walked away a free man after murdering Trayvon Martin in cold blood. In July of 2014, Eric Garner died after being wrestled to the ground by police officers and placed in an illegal chokehold in New York City. There was a video circulating of the incident that was broadcasted across all news broadcasts, and the world saw a man helpless as an officer choked him out to death, with other officers jumping in trying to bring Garner to the ground. Similar to Floyd's situation, he yelled the same words, "I can't breathe," and to no avail, the officers did not provide any medical attention at the scene. On August 9, 2014, an unarmed 18-year-old Michael Brown was fatally shot by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. This was an event where an officer used lethal force to stop a supposed scuffle that occurred between two suspects, shooting and killing Brown in the middle of the road. The situation could have been handled in a different way that did not have to involve lethal force. It was later discovered that the police department had a history of racial bias in the way of the courts and the police department in how they treated the African American community. On April 4, 2015, Walter Scott was shot and killed as he was fleeing from a police officer during a traffic stop in South Carolina. The shooting was captured on video, and in this shooting, the officer and Scott got into a scuffle, and once Scott started pulling away, that is when the officer pulled out his firearm and killed Scott with 8 shots. This was one of the first cases where we saw the officer that indicted for what he did and indicted for the murder of Walter Scott, where the officer was sentenced to a 20-year sentence because of the murder. In this slide, I'm going to talk more about solutions that can be done or that the police departments can implement in terms for the future to prevent incidents of police brutality. In terms of what can be done in the police departments to stop these incidents, there are many solutions that can make a positive impact and help regain the trust of many of its community members, especially African Americans. It seems that from most of the data collected, high discretion searches have been more commonly seen in terms of racial disparity. And when the California Highway Patrol banned high discretion searches, they discovered that racial disparities began to level off. Higher discretion searches sometimes are not the best way to deal with certain situations. Many believe the search for weapons is important, but the officers have to look at how it can negatively affect the situation, searching someone without reasonable suspicion to do so. Another solution that they have examined is adding cultural competence as a criterion for screening law enforcement officers. This can definitely be a positive impact in terms of hiring better fit officers to make sure the departments are hiring candidates that are best fit for the position and will not show a racial bias towards anybody and will treat all the same. Another solution that can be implemented is the implementation of using body-worn cameras to better monitor what the officers are doing out in the field, and has been a more talked about solution across the nation. This is a more costly solution, but can definitely help in terms of bettering the interactions with the community, as the officers' actions are being monitored and can later be reviewed by internal officers if there is a complaint. Many departments are slowly starting to implement body cameras in policing. Many are still in an alpha phase, testing out body-worn cameras with small batches of officers, and it could be seen as a very positive impact in the near future. Another solution that can be providing officers with more training, and particularly more mental health training, as many of the people that officers will help and deal with in the field may involve one or more people that have had one or more traumatic experiences in their lives involving law enforcement officers or other issues. So having better mental health training can help the officers in terms of game planning, what they can do to ease the situation for the individual and make them feel as comfortable as possible for the individual to explain to the officer the situation that is occurring. The images I used for this slide, image 6 was of a body-worn camera. That is what many officers across the nation are starting to implement in policing. Some of the bigger departments already have many body-worn cameras on their officers. There's still some that are still working on getting more. In image 7, what is seen as a high discretion search by the LAPD, and as stated in the Abrams 2020 article, California Highway Patrol has banned the high discretion searches, and they've seen that racial disparities began to level off. So this could definitely make a greater impact on the community, as those higher discretion searches have been seen more commonly with racial disparity. So I could definitely see this making a positive impact in the near future as well. And that is it for my presentation. Below you will find my references. I have 2 pages of references in regards to my information. And I also have a reference page for my images as well. Thank you, and have a good day, you guys.